Hi, Ivy. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Joanna. That's a pleasure.
Um, so Ivy worked with me at HSBC. Obviously, so growing up in China, then moved to the UK, then back to China, then back to the UK. So you've had various experiences moving around. I'd love to learn a little bit more around how you've found that and the differences you've experienced in the different working cultures.
Yeah, definitely. So I think for me, the job in HBC China is actually quite interesting in the sense that it is my first job working in China, even though I grew up in China. So I think the blessing that I had is still like the same company. So there are many things that are similar, things how things are run and how things are done. So the kind of common kind of HBC family, if you like. But
Hmm.
there are definitely things are quite different, and it kind of took me a while to actually discover that because people see you as a Chinese person, so they kind of maybe assume that you get it, but actually it's something that's a little bit subtle. So, for example, one thing I learned about kind of how you interact with your colleague, for example, especially more senior leadership, is quite interesting because in the UK, right, it's kind of everyday interaction is very flat. It's very democratic, if you like. So when you see someone, you just see what's in your mind. So you can say a few things that might be a bit challenging or interesting to them. But I found like in here, when I saw like senior leaders, like I might be very casual and just say, how you're doing, the sort of things on my mind. But after I kind of observe how people are interacting with the senior leader here is actually quite different. Initially, I thought there's so much flattery going on, but that seems to be a way of kind of getting to build the trust, if you like, almost. So that's one thing I have learned, right? Like before meeting or kind of just in your informal interactions, it's quite important to build this kind of respect and trust element, and that can be done in different ways. I think in Chinese culture, you definitely have to show them certain degree of appreciation, wanting to learn what is their thoughts. So that's like one element that I found is not that obvious, but it definitely helps to show your appreciation of their experience, their knowledge in a more maybe more obvious way.
Slightly more referential than you would be in the UK.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And how did you find fitting back in with colleagues in China?
I found like people in meetings, it's not very common to trying to just grab your time and talk what you want. Very often people would defer, as I was saying, to the most senior person in the meeting, so they wanted to hear from them first, and very often people needs to be prompted. So I think once they have that kind of almost like the permission to speak, people can be quite open and talk about issues. But very often it's kind of this initial kickoff. How can you instill the kind of confidence and trust in people that this is relatively open, it's just discussion, like people should just be open about their mind. And very often I found that like smaller groups works much better, like in China, like big group is very often like very hard. You very often end up like people not saying very much. So sometimes I find the most effective way is you might have bilateral conversations with different people first, kind of really explain to them what is he trying to get out of the meeting. Then once you're all together in a meeting, because the kind of agreement is being almost made already, and they know a little bit more from the document that you send, where you're coming from, and that way the meeting and the decision making can actually happen a lot faster. So I think once people are behind a decision, things can move very fast.
Mhm. And how about when you move back to the UK this time? Has there been a reverse culture shock again, readjusting?
Yeah, I think there has actually. So when I was talking about in meetings, because uh like in China, I almost kind of adopted this attitude, like I wanted to hear what the most senior person has to say and kind of wait for your turns. But in here, if you adopt this approach, it's being perceived rather negatively. It's like you're in the room, like you're expected to say things, and if you want to say more things, that perceived as you are engaged, you're interested. So kind of listening skills, like on the face of it, is not appreciated as much in a group setting. So in the group setting, like they expect you to do much more contributing, much more kind of interacting with the people. And I think the leader, the managers here, they actually like to be challenged in a positive way. So when they hear something that's different or interesting they have never thought about, you can see that they are genuinely appreciating that. So I think that's the element, if you want to have a kind of more prominence and in the business working environment and to try and exert your influence, that's definitely something that's very important to, be present, be active, like say things that are you think are relevant and interesting. So kind of, taking a back seat is definitely not a good approach here.
Mm-hmm. And when you moved back to Shanghai, having been in the UK for quite a long time beforehand, was there anything that surprised you about working in China?
So it doesn't work very well as a sort of consultant style, if you like. So when you have, if because I worked in group and had interaction with people locally as well, so it doesn't work very well that you just come in and you say, we know you have this problem and this is a great solution. So very often you have to invest the time and energy to understand what is it they have already done on their end, to show your understanding, your appreciation before you kind of dish out advice, suggestions. So I found that quite important. So sometimes you almost need to kind of undersell what you can bring to really kind of get them to be more receptive. So you coming in as, a help, you kind of, you complement what they're trying to do rather than, I'm coming in to, change how things are done, to do things our way, my way. So I think that's the bit that's quite important, to find an angle to kind of work in a more complementary way. And once you have the trust going, it's the time for you to bring more radical ideas, how you do things different.
And I think there's a lot to learn for any culture there, that actually implementation of ideas can be so much more effective if you've spent that time to engage and to invest in the relationship and the building that trust first. I think we assume maybe in the UK and similar cultures that you don't need to spend that time, but actually even here, having invested that time would be beneficial on things happening faster in the long term.
Yeah, definitely. So I was just like going through my memory. There was one meeting that I had, for example. We were trying to say, this is the problem statement, and then we were going to dive into the problem statement. But because I didn't really invest the time to talk to, the senior people from different part of the organization. So when they come in, they said, I don't think there's a problem. So because of this very strong stance the person have taken, and it made, it's basically you can't progress with the conversation anymore. So that's definitely the surprise for me. So you think this is a very obvious problem that everybody would recognize, but
Mm.
because what you have not done to kind of really establish, is it an issue, how do they perceive it, so it can be a backlash if you have not done this properly.
Mm. And is there anything you miss having returned to the UK from that time working in Shanghai?
Yeah, I think there's the working culture is different in the sense that it's very common to kind of invest time with your colleagues. So in China, and I think to a certain degree in Hong Kong, like people working longer hours, but they also take longer like lunch break. So it's very uncommon for someone to like, eat your sandwich behind your desk. Like in China, like you are kind of expected to spend the time, to have lunch with your colleagues, to understand, them a little better on a personal level. And you do this regularly. I mean, if you are in the office, it's very often like very few people in from 12 to 1:30 that time. So it's kind of like a dedicated time, uh, to invest in kind of relationship building in a nice way. You also get fed, you appreciate the food. So I think that's the bit that I miss. Like people have this mutual understanding that that's how you do it. So I think that's the bit where it's a little bit missing in the UK, because of the commute that people are very focused on getting this done and I leave. So I think that's yeah, that's the bit I miss most.
Yes, I did learn fairly quickly that organizing lunch meetings was not popular in China in a way that you might do in London. Um, Great. There's lots of useful tips there. I think that will be very helpful for people, and reminds me of all the things I miss as well in Shanghai that coming back to the UK. So thank you very much, Ivy. That's really helpful. Thank you.